In my last video about this wonderful game, I refrained from speaking in detail about the inner workings of the story, instead putting it off for another video. I eventually came to realize that if I tried to talk about the entirety of Guild Wars 2's narrative in a single video, we would be here so long that Blizzard might just have time to create their own assets for World of Warcraft. This game has been online for over 10 years at this point, and the scale of content available reflects that. The story of Guild Wars 2 starts with your character as a fledgling novice in the home of their respective race. A series of events leads to them joining the company of both some of the world's most renowned heroes and the next generation that's prepared to follow them. The presence of elder dragons, gods, and whoever else believes themselves capable of punching above their weight threatens all of Tyria, and it falls to you to put a stop to them. Said story is split into an assortment of acts, of which there are individual episodes within. There's the personal story, which is the individualized story attached to the player character, the expansion pack specific adventures, which, as you might expect, are tied to the release of each game's 3 expansion packs, and then you have the living world content, which are chapters that focus a fair bit more on expanding the world of Tyria. With the exception of the Icebrood saga, they are typically smaller than the base game and expansion content, but still provide many of the same amenities, such as new areas and items. Do not be deceived by the fact that the living world content is smaller. This stuff is just as important to the canon of the world and story, and that is why we are here. Before I dive in, I just want to preface that there will be spoilers in this episode as we're talking about story content. This video was also written with the idea that you, the viewer, have knowledge of the general story itself. If you don't want parts of the plot spoiled for you, I would recommend clicking away now. My first Guild Wars 2 video is completely spoiler-free, so if you haven't seen it yet, feel free to check it out. See, perhaps the best part of the different segments of the story being broken into separate chapters and episodes is the fact that it allows the player to replay any part that they desire whenever they like. There are a number of achievements, items, and challenges associated with completing episodes in particular ways. If you're like me and focus solely on the content of the story on your first playthrough, then you'll likely miss a lot of stuff. And oftentimes, you can only do so much in a single go, almost necessitating replays for any completionist out there. This was true for every story chapter in the game, except one. The very first additional story arc of any kind was the first season of Living World, originally released in January 2013, that continued receiving updates until March of the following year. It had a lot of content, tackling multiple different aspects of the game's lore and featuring a number of prominent characters over the course of its run. Unlike the chapters that would follow, the first Living World story was constructed to be temporarily available. You were only able to participate in these episodes as they were literally going on in Tyria. In the 8 years since the event ended, as the episodes were no longer available, players had the option of watching what was effectively a summary that recounted the events of the chapter. In more recent years, around the time of the Icebrood saga's release, a very select few moments were finally made playable through the scrying pool mechanic found in the Eye of the North. The problem with the player being left without the ability to play the chapter proper is Living World Season 1 is really important. So important that no amount of summarization or snapshots in time can amend the black hole that was the absence of it. The best way I can think of to describe the story of Guild Wars 2 without Season 1 is like a dinner served without a place setting. Not only does it provide the backstory for many of the plot points that would come later, it also introduces some of your closest allies who, at this point, have been present in just about every following chapter in one way or another. The premise of most of the season's story is that it acts as the bridge between the personal story and the much greater overarching narrative of the world. That gap is bridged when your cool aunt or uncle, who you name drop at parties for street cred because they're a renowned cast member of the world's most famous dysfunctional family, sends you out to help with a rising number of threats. For the most part, the player finds themselves fighting what's known as the Molten Alliance, a partnership between the Flame Legion sect of the Char and the mole-like Dredge, and the Aetherblades, a gang of pirates wielding a strange form of magic. And while their actions don't have as much impact on the following story as the former two, the Inquest decide to step in because they've never heard of an ass-kicking that they didn't want to be invited to, as well as another alliance between the Nightmare Court of the Sylvari and the Crate, who serve as the main muscle for the season's antagonist. The fact that the Flame Legion was outright stupid enough to align with the Dredge is a huge obstacle in the unification of the Char factions that takes place in the Icebrood saga. The Flame Legion's guilt and desire for a shot at redemption is a constant subplot, which is ironic because the only person who gets a shot of anything is Smote. As for the Aether Blades, who effectively disappear after you beat them back, they return to raise hell and End of Dragons, led once again by Mai Trin, that bitch. There are certainly plot points in this game's story that are a bit more self-contained, such as, quite frankly, a lot of what you do in Path of Fire before Kralkatorrik shows up to absorb the magical energy from Balthazar's death. But what's present in Season 1 really isn't so inconsequential, and I'll get a bit more into that later. While working against the evil forces, the player makes a number of new acquaintances. Not only are they important in the immediate dealings, what with how they literally help you in battle, but also in the future. The Bram shown in this chapter is a prideful, hot-headed youngin', a far cry from the guy that would make the decision to become the living aspect of an Elder Dragon later on. And Taimi's development into the foremost authority on the often unseen activity of the Elder Dragons is a lot more surprising when you see her as an annoying tag-along kid in these earlier arcs. If you're like me and were forced to go from the personal story to Season 2, you didn't know that Canuck was an outright enemy at one point. Everyone's favorite snarker certainly wasn't a favorite of the characters for a time, that's for sure. That being said, some of these characters have been hit with a fair bit of developmental rot in the years that followed. Jory Delacroix gets a lot of characterization, only to be slapped with an injury and had her following involvement markedly reduced until a huge return in End of Dragons. And if the fact that Rox was barely involved in an arc that was completely centered around her race of people doesn't say anything, nothing will. The point still stands that Season 1 is the start for most of these characters. And, of course, none of this would have happened were it not for one Scarlet Briar. Briar is, generously, a terrible person. Realistically, she's a sociopathic terrorist mastermind who wanted nothing more than to watch Tyria and its people burn. While the means through which she perpetuates her terror are largely reserved to the season itself, the impact of said terror certainly is not. There is a reasonable argument to be made that nearly everything that would come after Season 1 was in some way started or worsened by her actions. After failing to capture the Queen, she leads the destruction of Lion's Ark, the wake of which leaves numerous citizens with a debilitating respiratory disease known as Scarlet's Rattle, which is a detail that feels entirely too real considering the state of the world the past 2 years. But killing her wasn't even enough to stop her from succeeding in her ultimate goal, which was that of awakening an Elder Dragon. Mordramoth specifically, who would go on to try and subjugate an entire race of people. The fact that the commander was then forced to kill Mordramoth further strengthened every other Elder Dragon after they had already received a dose of steroids from Zaitan's death in the personal story. And yes, I get it, Mordramoth drove her insane, which is part of why she did what she did. But we also saw in the Heart of Thorns campaign that the Sylvari are fully capable of resisting his influence over them, and she still decided to do his dirty work. Regardless of the reason, Briar put a runaway train on the tracks that the commander and company have now spent almost an entire in-game decade trying to pull the emergency brake on, and it all happened in a section of story that wasn't available to the player for over 8 years. Look, I'm not going to harp on the decision to make it temporary. I'm sure at the time it seemed like an awesome idea that probably helped the world come to life in a fresh and unique way. It gave credit to the title Living World. But I think we can all agree, especially for those who came later, such as myself, it wasn't exactly a great business decision in hindsight. Season 1 and its state within the game is a prime example of why stories can't just be a sum of their best parts. This is going to sound odd, but stories need some boring to them. They need the conversations between characters, the downtime in which the player is left to stew on details themselves, the fights against the random mooks, those sorts of things. It's all the parts that don't get mentioned in a summary that help to deepen understanding and appreciation of those more important events. You can't have a climax if it isn't built up to first. Don't mistake my criticism for some sort of belief that the game isn't better off with the inclusion of its summary. Something is better than nothing, and you can tell that ArenaNet really did try to make sure they provided as much context as they could within the boundaries of the game itself. While the effort might be commendable, the reality was still that if you wanted to truly understand what happened in Season 1, you'd have to spend time cramming on the wiki like you were studying for a final. Back in March, ArenaNet announced that Season 1, in its proper episodic form, would be returning, with new chapters released throughout the year. Finally, those that missed out are able to experience the season in nearly all of its glory. It's not a complete conversion, with certain episodes already confirmed to be cut from this re-release, but it is miles better than what the player has had access to up until this point. 2 episodes have been released already, with another 3 on the way. If you never had the chance to experience Season 1, there's no better time than now. End of Dragons, by name alone, seems to suggest that the Commander's adventures are coming to an end. That's far from the case, with both a new Living World season and expansion pack announced in the past months. Considering how relevant it's been to the world up until this point, it's a safe bet that it's unlikely to become any less so in the future. Do yourself a favor and play through it, and suffer with the rest of us as we wait for more.
If dragon magic can really be used for good, that changes everything. And as a scientist, she seems very capable and motivated, but not in a scary Scarlet Briar kind of way. Oh, no offense.
She says none taken.